some of the information we'll be going through will be similar to what we discussed last time, but do quick introductions, I guess, and there's a sign-in sheet that should be going around if y'all make sure you. In some cases, we tried to populate the spreadsheet there with names that we were knew of and whatnot, so if that you can just check off or whatever, but if not, no harm, just add your name where you can. But again, my name's Greg Judy. I'm project manager and engineer with Neil Schaefer, and Trey Todd is with me today. And this is y'all. Most of y'all were here, a couple months ago, and I do need to say, I apologize. It took vacations and that kind of thing kind of got in the way. We had intended to get back together toward the end of June, first part of July or so, but it allowed us to organize this information. Yeah, y'all just do what you need to just to pass that around. I'm going to go down a few slides, and these should be on the monitor. I'm just going to go down the line, and if there's someone representing the project, y'all please just feel free to speak up and introduce yourselves again. We'll just try to do what we did last time. So anybody from Project Titan today here?
Hey, yep.
Okay.
Jim Kirk with Harco Murray, design build firm out of Nashville. Also got Garrett back there with Kinley Horn. Yep.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you for being here. Kelly, you're here. Harvest Point.
Harvest Point, Kelly Beasley.
Yeah, how are you doing? Doing all right?
Great, how are you?
Yeah, doing good. Ship, the ship developments, yeah.
Yeah, hi, this is Suzanne Jackson with Barge Coffin, and then Steve Jasinski with DCI, the architecture.
Yeah. Thanks for all being here again. You mentioned the ERG. I'll move on to Barton Hills. Anyone from Barton Hills representing? Flex Joe, Flex Matt?
Yep.
See ya. And then Phorecia. So again, these are all the developments that will be participating in the improvements that we talked about. So the first few slides, again, we'll kind of rehash and kind of review what we talked about before, and then we'll get into some of the analysis that's been completed since we last talked, and recommendations and so forth, and what are the next steps. We hope this brings us pretty close to the conclusion to the discussion that we've been having. There'll be a little bit more work, tasks that we'll tie up at the end, and we'll go over those in the next steps. But largely what we're discussing today, and again, opportunity for questions and anything y'all want details you want to get into. It's really a purpose for today. Again, just some of the overview. There were 12 total projects that are in the area that were included in terms of the analysis and so forth, but not 9, which we just went through. They're actually participating in the identified improvements at the intersection. And again, some of the methodology and kind of the tasks that we've done previously. Again, we go get a little more detail on this in a few slides here in a minute. But again, just reaching out, and the purpose of that first get together that we had in May was really just to kind of create that understanding and start the dialogue. So again, some set up expectations and just have an understanding of what the purpose of this is and what the city's trying to accomplish with the project and the effort. So again, I just want to reiterate the importance and appreciate your all's time being here. That this stakeholder outreach was one of the first things that Calvin and staff really wanted to emphasize, is making sure this is transparent and that we had good participation in that. So I think we accomplished that, and we'll continue to do that. Again, y'all know the intersection. Again, this is focused now the analysis and the studies focused on the Beechcroft Road and Cleburne Drive intersection. Again, this slide, the highlighted kind of the white areas, again, just highlight again the 12 projects, 12 areas that again is kind of the subject matter. And then again, the 9 that are actually participating, and this kind of their general vicinity and location. They are representative to the intersection. We showed this slide before as well. Again, this is something we'd already had calculated as far as the trip generation. And again, don't worry about reading all the numbers. It's not, it's all additive, and we'll get a little bit more into the numbers in a minute. But the intent here is just really to convey and express the extent and broadness, if you will, of the different projects that are coming online. Of course, there are different phases, different timelines, but our design year and kind of horizon year that we're looking at is 2028, so a little over 5 years, 5 years from now. And again, we presented this in May as well, is where these are the trips. The previous slide were trips in total. Now, as any particular development has their trips that come and go, they obviously distribute different directions. The table that we had prior was a calculation for all trips. These numbers represent the trips from each site development that actually passes through the intersection, which will go more toward obviously the impacts and how we work through the assessment. Any questions or anything that's not clear?
Just two, sorry. One, the trip generation, are you finding those from our traffic studies, or did you guys do a new one for those?
Yeah, so it was the same. I believe Gillian Fishback prepared your all's traffic study, and all the practitioners will use the same source. Those sources have been updated, somewhat over the years. That was done in 2016, I think. But generally, the basis is the same. And we took the trips as presented in the original traffic study. So some of the developments didn't have a traffic study prepared. The ones that did, we used those numbers that were prepared out of the previously approved trips. So if for your all's case, it was the same trips that was generated as part of your all's study at the time it was prepared. So,
Great.
Yeah.
So the stuff that you have from people with studies are from theirs, and then you guys provided the study for the other traffic counts.
Well, we prepared the trip generation analysis. We didn't really prepare a study for those sites per se, but we just prepared the calculations that you see on the screen, or they'll be in the report. So we just had to fill in the holes, right, where they weren't already known. We had to go in and make those calculations, and at that point they all just aggregate together. I guess to expand on that, you asked about the chip generation. The next component of that conversation is then the distribution, because that, at the end of the day, that matters a lot too. Because the generation can be one thing, but depending on where people expect to come in terms of the path that they follow to and from, and we followed the same mannerism with that, where like in Gillian's study, and any of y'all that had traffic studies that prepared at the time that they were reviewed, there were trip distributions and assignments prepared as that. And again, we just mimicked and just used the same information. So we did not recreate or recalculate that. There's also obviously analysis and assumptions that were made by your all's engineer that at that time when we're not in a position to second guess or go back through that process. So we just used the same numbers. So the only additive that we did were for those projects that didn't have that information.
As far as the email that you sent me in regards to year by year,
Yes.
so we obviously didn't account for what has been built today, meaning it's not included in the numbers that are being presented today. So all that is basically from 2023 on to 2028,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
So,
So Gillian's study was basically for the whole development.
yes.
And there's obviously been stuff that's been built today, up to
Yes.
today. So these numbers are not reflecting Gillian's numbers, if that makes sense. We aren't double dipping.
Okay, yes, I'm following you now.
Okay.
Great. My only other question was, you had mentioned 12 properties contributing traffic, but only 9 having an equitable stake. Can you elaborate on the reasoning behind that?
I'll have to defer to this, Calvin, maybe if there was a specific thought process between the 9 that are involved in it.
Yeah, when we looked at which developments would have an equitable share, it was only those developments that were conditioned to have.
With their approvals?
That's correct. If they were not conditioned, they
You
don't.
have no power to ask them that. I
That's
understand. Okay.
Like a water under the bridge kind of a thing.
Oh, believe me, I understand both sides of that one, but I was just curious as to how that
Yeah,
worked.
so from a traffic, those numbers, those are the 3 for say, let's say, had to be in part of the calculation to know what needs to happen as far as the intersection goes. But from the funding and financing and that side of it, like Calvin said, it's just, those other 3 were not part of the condition requirements when they went through their approvals, I guess. So,
Cool, thank you.
yeah. Good questions. It's a good question. We need to make sure it's clear, like I said. So, again, these just represent the trip. So again, whether Neil Schaefer came up with distributions on the projects that didn't have a study previously completed for them, or again, for the most part, more than half had
Yeah,
one?
the majority.
Majority had traffic studies. So again, we, just to make things simple and it's stuff that had already been approved and reviewed or, considered, we just used the same information out of those particular traffic studies to kind of piece it all together. There's really kind of a Frankenstein thing going on because of the pieces and parts all over, and it's really just, he's too young to have gray hair, but
I'm starting to get it.
but it was a process for us to understand everything that was going on, the timing of it and the size and and even the location and so forth, and that all kind of plays into it. So once we got our head around everything that was going on, we were in a better place. But it took a minute just because it's a little complicated just because of the number of projects going on. But
Hey, Greg.
yeah, Suzanne.
Just a follow-up
Yeah, for
question.
sure.
So if there's 9 parties participating in the equitable share distribution, are your final numbers divided by 9 or 12? Like,
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got
Okay.
some information right to that. So I'm not trying to divert your question, but we've got a table and some stuff you can see. But generally speaking, it's based on honestly, it's based on those trips.
Okay.
Like on a percentage relative
Okay.
basis, yeah. So to move to the next step of the analysis, we had to, again, create kind of a base year scenario so we can kind of understand what's going on in like today's world, and then project it out once we reach the full build-out year. And we discussed last time how there's really 2 background growths that we kind of account for. One is just the general community growth, and that's what we call that and refer to that as ambient growth. And that 2.5% is what we ended up using, and that was consistent with what the other traffic studies had used. I think we ran the numbers ourselves based on some recent counts that TDOT maintains, and I think it was pretty close to the same, I think. So that worked out well. And then you add on the development growth, so it's like A plus B equals the total. So that's kind of where that comes from. So this is just a figure representing kind of where those total volumes turn out, just to give you a sense. I probably should have included the existing so you can kind of get a sense of how the change takes place. But I think a couple things that are interesting to maybe point out here that will mean more when we get into some of the analysis discussion and assessment discussions. I don't know how well that, I guess y'all can see that pretty well. But, just a couple things that pop out at us and anybody that looks at this is the magnitude of the westbound left turns. That plays a role into this some. Obviously the northbound approach on Cleburne, but specifically the right turn. When it comes to traffic signal operations, design, and even the warrant analysis, now the warrants are what engineers use to justify, in a manner of speaking, whether there are a lot of rules we kind of go through and look through, but there's a federal document, a national document called the MUTCD. Some of y'all probably have used that and are familiar with it. But within that document, there's thresholds and justification mainly from volume standpoint of when a signal might be considered or when it may not be justified. And that will play back a little bit as it relates to these volumes that we see on Cleburne Road. What's notable is how the difference between the left and the right turn movements. So it's no surprise, everybody knows how heavy the right turn is relative to the left turn. And we'll talk more about some of that in a minute. But when we're talking about 600 vehicles, 5 years from now, that's pretty significant when it comes to an intersection like this. And going back to 2016 when it was first identified as a potential need for signalization, it's somewhat comforting to know that they were on that track. Truthfully, it's probably not warranted today, just based on the numbers that we see, and part of that's just because the volume on the Cleburne Road hasn't quite gotten there. That over a course of many hours. Again, one thing I probably need to mention is that it's generally not based on just 1 hour. I mean, the warrants are typically based on either an 8-hour warrant, so you have to have a minimum amount of volume over a course of 8 hours of a typical day. There's another warrant that's a 4-hour warrant. So if you can kind of think about that, 8 hours, well, that's probably trying to get at what is the signal needed over the course of a complete day. A 4-hour warrant's more of a commute kind of a situation. If there's a lot of arrivals or departures based on commuting or employment kind of issues with the workday, that's kind of the purpose of the 4-hour warrant. And there's several other warrants, but as it relates to this situation, those are the two that probably play the most. Thing I'll go ahead and touch on that kind of matters, and it gets a little detailed, but think about how a traffic signal works. Generally, you can turn right on red, when you approach a signal. So standard practice nationally, but with TDOT and if we were doing the study as well, was generally we would discount or subtract off some of that right turn volume because to try to replicate the ability of, and just the stance of right turners being able to turn right turn drivers being able to turn right on red. So what I'm trying to say is that when you look at a warrant volume and say, all right, well, how many cars per hour over a number of hours are turning right? Some of those are again, subtracted off that total because technically they could potentially turn right on red and wouldn't necessarily be needed for a signal standpoint. So it's standard practice for us to go through a methodology to subtract off some of the right turns before we actually do the analysis for the signals, because it's saying, and in this case, if it's 560 cars in the AM turning right from a warrant, it'll be some percentage of that, lower than that, based on the calculations that we do. So the main point I'm trying to convey is that whether it's this intersection or just in your daily life driving around, if you see an intersection that you think, well, that needs a signal. Well, if it's predominantly a right turn movement that on the side street, not necessarily, because of some of these assumptions and kind of gyrations that we go through with the analysis. So it's important to point out, because the right turn movement's probably 80, 90%, give or take, of the volume that's on the side street. So when it comes time to getting a permit with TDOT and throwing that information out there for them to go through that process, that traffic signal warrant that was done as part of the Harvest Point TIS earlier, probably going to need to be updated based on the kind of the current status and updated volumes and that kind of thing. And that'll be part of the process that we go to. I'm looking at Calvin just because just to kind of make him aware, because there's conditions that have changed, and we'll talk more about that later. But that information will need to be passed on to the department as part of the permit process and getting their approval, since obviously Beechcroft is a state route. So again, I've kind of preluded and kind of forecast a little bit of kind of what we did. But again, from just an analysis standpoint, definitely looked at the AM and PM peak periods, and that gets back into those entering and exit splits. That's that distribution that we've been talking about. And then, in addition to signal warrant analysis, there are capacity analysis that we calculate, and we'll be showing the results of those. And the good thing here is that the intersection, I think out of the Harvest Point development, has been improved with turn lanes and whatnot. So that plays a role here. I want to just introduce a little bit to just to kind of what does the traffic analysis mean, and how we measure that. Many of y'all have seen some of this before, but it's given a letter grade, kind of like I always use the school analogy, kind of A to F. But in terms of numbers, what that means is it's a basis of what kind of driver acceptance is in terms of delay. How long are you willing to wait before it gets, that was kind of long, and then later on, if it's longer, though, that was not really comfortable or not really satisfactory. So it kind of ranges from obviously 0 to up. F is kind of the threshold for an F. Generally, anything that's a D or better, A through D, is considered acceptable, especially in our urban areas, and we talked about that some last time. So E's and F's are really what we're looking for just from a level service and delay standpoint. So as you look at these charts, this first slide, when it gets to level service, is that once we ran the analysis. So we based it. The chart on the table on the left is for like today, 2022. Existing conditions, kind of existing volumes, and then the table on the right is the build-out year, 2028, with those volumes predicted. So we're talking that ambient growth, those development growth, but still the current conditions out there as they're out there on the street right now. So was a stop sign controlled on Claiborne Road. So this kind of alludes back to what I was talking about. There's, for the most part, the level of service out there today is actually not that bad in the grand scheme of things. Again, these are based on hour averages. If you pull up any particular time of the hour with AM and PM, there could be obviously a little bit of congestion out there. But the analysis is based on getting an average hour standpoint. So, for that northbound approach is what we're kind of focused on. Level service D, and then for the AM, and then level service C for the PM. But obviously it changes quite a bit, 5 years, 6 years from now, once the growth of the community and the growth with the developments that are becoming online. So again, these aren't signal warrants, but this just sets the stage and helps give us a pretty good clue. Again, but some of it's common sense. I mean, that's nothing really anybody didn't already expect, but it kind of put some numbers to what that delay looks like. And again, we show some Q links here too. So, again, that right turn, projected to be around maybe 400 feet or so if things stay the status quo. So at that point, we started kind of just doing some brainstorming and with the signal obviously being an obvious choice of an improvement. I'm going to skip over this, and we created some drawings we came up with two scenarios. The first is geometrically everything stay the way it is out there, except some minor pavement marking changes to help increase some of the stacking potential on the northbound approach. But again, that's mainly just pavement markings, no or hardscape kind of stuff. But basically just implementing a traffic signal. So that's scenario one. And then primarily it was, again, pretty obvious that that westbound left turn was going to be kind of an issue or source of an issue potentially. So we came up with the concept of what that would look like if we implemented a dual left, obviously under a signalized conditions. And of course, you go into this knowing it's easier said than done. There's a lot of things that would have to happen, and there's a lot of implications with that. But right away, utilities, and the cost in general. So, but we're like to try to give choices. And again, not saying how serious or how excited the city would be to tackle something like this, but just from our end, we just try to provide choices and then go have the discussion from there. So if we go back to the slide and kind of interesting to kind of compare and contrast some of the differences between, again, the table 3 on the left is just the signalized version only, and then the one right is with the additional turn lane. And I think it probably accomplishes what we thought it would in terms of going to a double left. I mean, obviously, as you can see, and particularly the PM peak, I'll call your attention to the PM peak and the bottom main row. You go from a level service F with over 100-second delay to level service D, and that's obviously the intent and what would you expect to happen. That really is where it gets into a situation where, so is it worth that cost and all the things that would have to happen to if you have a dual left, that means you're going to have to widen Cleveland Road to allow for the accepting lanes to go southbound on Cleveland Road, and there's a lot involved in that. So, all right, well, we don't know what the cost is, but we know it's going to be a lot, or and certainly more than just adding a signal. So then our attention kind of turns to, all right, well, so how much of improvement, and is it that much different than just doing the signal? And this is where we had some conversations with the city and staff to kind of get their sense of where their thoughts would be on this, and showing them this information. So the way it turned out, if you look at overall level service results for the AM, they're both still level service C, and keeping in mind this is forecast. We're forecasting out 5-6 years. We don't really. It's going to be, we're going to promise you it's going to be 24.8 seconds delay per vehicle. No, of course not. So these are all just, we kind of take this with a grain of salt, and these are just averages just to kind of get a feel for what these different scenarios look like. And again, even in the PM peak, even though with just the signal only, it's a level service D, that's, there's intersections in town that we'd love to have a level service D at that we don't have today. So if you kind of get the direction where I'm headed with this kind of discussion, certainly that double left scenario would provide more functionality and reduce delay for that double left. But in the grand scheme of things, for the cost and all the kind of issues that would be brought up with trying to implement a project like that, and discussing those issues with the city, we're recommending just going the signal route with the geometry that's out there and not really advance or promote the double left. The other thing that operationally you got to think about too is what happens when you have a double left in a signalized operation. It's going to be protected only. So the only time you could turn left would be on when the green arrows come up, and otherwise you're having to wait. And that's where you have to think about, well, what about in the evening, on the weekends when it's not as busy out there? You'd have the situation still where if you have a double left turn, there'd be drivers having to wait to turn left. But you could see, decent amount of distance, and you really could turn left, but you can't because the signal's telling you can't. So, I guess my explanation from that is just from the standpoint there are times these are just peak hours. There are times of the day that, a double left isn't needed at all, and so we try to kind of weigh those decisions or weigh those factors when making these decisions. So that's kind of how we kind of arrived at the preference being. A traffic signal, maintaining the existing geometry that's out there with a little bit of pavement line work. So this functional sketch is just meant to kind of convey and illustrate that, and kind of what we're thinking along those lines. It would be a cantilever, kind of a black, style traffic signal, and so forth. So pretty straightforward, I think. But certainly, if there are any questions or anything that we didn't cover, anything that comes to mind.
On the widening one, were you widening Cleburne as well to have okay, so 2 lanes to turn in?
Yeah,
That's what I was
Suzanne, at
wondering.
this stage, without having survey and all that, I don't know, I mean, is it possible that you'd love to widen equally on both sides to limit the right-of-way impacts?
Yeah.
I think we've generally just showed it more on the west side, knowing that DRG, is that the development in that corner, that there may be a little bit more right-of-way on that, just because of the development as far as what space is available. We didn't really spend a lot of time, investigating or really being able to answer that question. Because again, this is more of a functional concept type situation. But the point is that you've got 3 lanes, generally it's a 3-lane cross section out there right now, and you'd have to go. And that's the other thing too. It's not as simple as, all right, well, how far do you take the 2 lanes? So it's, your all's experience, our experience, I know for sure. If you have that accepting 2 lanes just for a certain amount of distance, it really doesn't do you a whole lot of good back upstream, because everybody's going to want to get in one of the 2 left turn lanes, and that defeats the whole purpose of having a dual left in the first place. So in some cases, I've seen these go as far as 1,500 feet. I mean, you're talking about a quarter of a mile, maybe not quite. Again, we really didn't get that invested in investigating that, because we didn't see that as this scenario as being as much a viable option based on everything we've been talking about. But the point is, it's more than just the first, certainly more than 400 or 500 feet. It would have to go a certain amount of distance. With the amount of left turn volume that we're talking about, would want to fully utilize that double left, and to make that happen, you would have to, those receiving lanes would have to go for a bit of a distance. So that's in the weeds, and I know it's something, y'all maybe don't care about that kind of stuff, but what it does speak to is the cost and just the menage of going through, what an improvement would look like that. So that's a lot of what goes in the process of kind of considering that. So, but again, it's a 3-leg intersection. For all intents and purposes, what we call 3 signal phases operating. That's a pretty efficient operation. So we do expect some queuing. I can go back to that slide if anybody really want. You can see that from a queuing standpoint, we're still looking at 500 plus or minus queue left turn that will obviously extend, but luckily we have a center turn lane. That's goes back a distance, and at that point, that's where it kind of any one day that could ebb and flow. It just depends. The one thing we're mainly concerned about was, would that queue routinely, repeatedly, often block any of these driveways, some of which you all probably have business pretty close to, and we wouldn't want that. But I think we looked at it, and it was kind of marginal. The next closest driveway, at least for what we know, is not right up close to the Cleburne intersection, so we had a little relief there. And so again, weighing all these things that we're talking about, there's going to be queuing, especially on that left turn. There's probably going to be queuing on the northbound right turn, but the signal will, again, it gets in the weeds a little bit, but our recommendation would be, from an operation standpoint, to keep a cycle length, the timing's snappy, to keep it turn over, as opposed to what you see on Main Street or other streets around the area where they run more of a coordinated cycle that has a longer cycle length. This is going to be an isolated signal that would just hopefully turn over and keep things moving a little bit more than they would if they were in a more of a congested arterial situation. So that would help manage the queues some. So that just a little bit more why we're pretty comfortable, I think, kind of moving forward with this direction. So yeah, good question. Probably talking too much, but that's all right. Anything else in terms of kind of what the recommendation and kind of what that looks like?
I think given the couple different ones, this might be something you're getting to later.
Mm-hmm.
Is it now, like, Calvin, your team is kind of looking at these options and then presenting to planning commission? Like, what's the next step for determining which we do?
Well, the conversation is, we're looking at a single turn lane, not a dual.
Mm-hmm.
So the next step is identifying the trips generated and the proportionate share, or the equitable share, for each developer.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the decision's
Yeah.
kind of been made at the staff level. Again,
Okay.
not to
Making
put
recommendations.
the staff on. Yeah. Not knowing what Calvin and staff would need to do, but I think the feedback that I think we got when we talked internally was that they're pretty comfortable moving forward. So I don't know if there's more formal decisions. I think everything has been equal. That's where we're at, and I think that's what we can pretty much expect.
That's what I was curious about, actually,
Yeah.
if it has to go through other approvals, or if this is what we.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Good question.
I had a question too. So in terms of, do you have this in your presentation for how the cost would be? I know it's based on the trips over 9, whatever it
do.
happens to be, but
Yeah.
Calvin, is this a conversation later that we have regarding, specifically, we were told a certain grade of traffic signal. We've already completed our other widening things on Claiborne and the intersection that were required. So looking specifically at Harvest Point, we have a different commitment. Now, if it makes sense and the pro rata portion dilutes something, we will consider what that looks like. We want to be a good steward. But when is the time for us to talk about how all of that goes? Because this scope is very different than what my traffic study calls for.
Right, Harvest Point is a little different. So I think with you and Harvest Point, we will have another conversation
Later.
to further that out.
Okay.
But the other developers aren't in the same position that you're in.
Sure. Wonderful. I just needed to know if
Yeah.
that was a discussion
Now,
for today.
it
or
is.
not.
So we've got some numbers today to present what that proportion looks like, not in dollars, not in terms of dollars, but in terms of the percentage.
Sure.
Now, the next question is going to be, well, how much does a traffic signal cost? And we can talk about that. But just to give you some thought to take away from today, the formal, final, that's a conversation that happens between, I think, each entity and each project development and the city. And we can go and kind of get into it. This is it. Your question was a good time because this is the next slide. So, and it goes back to what Suzanne was asking. So right now what we're trying to do is express percentage-wise. So if the signal costs X, this is how it's going to be split up percentage-wise. And this is based on the trip. So for each of the projects that again, honestly, if you compare this table back to the other information we were showing earlier, where we were showing all the entering trips into the intersection, these are these volumes that for the PM peak. So for the PM peak, which is the design hour, this is how. So that there's a total of 1,098 trips between all 9 projects, and then we show it in terms of trips, but also as the percentage. So when we've prepared studies similar to this in the past, it's really as simple as whatever that final cost ends up being, which we won't really know what that final cost is. And that's some of the semantics I think city still needs to figure out, and we can help guide or discuss that. But because y'all are in project estimating all the time, so I don't have to tell you all. Right now, we can get within 20% of what we think it's going to be, and then when the design's done, we'll be down to maybe a 5 to 10% window, and then when it's bid is when you'll really know. And I think the question that is yet to be answered, and it's just something that semantics have to be worked out, is what cost is used to figure out what each of the projects share is, as far as the if is it 100,000, is it 300,000, whatever that number is. At what point does that number get calculated? And we don't know the answer to that right now. But the main point right for today is kind of expressing and documenting what that percent shared trip, because whatever the cost ends up being, it'll be based on these, in our opinion, or based on the study, based on these percentages.
That makes sense to me. To go back to your analogy about the school and the grading system, I'm guessing that it would be more like we're going to give a curve here based on what we would have been required to do versus and what we've already accomplished, because we've already started paying into improvements in this area.
Right.
And I appreciate that you made sure about not double dipping on whatever that happens to be. So I guess once we get into the nitty gritty, we can start. I just want to make sure that on the record here today, we understand that while our trips may be 45%, we've already been paying towards some of that with other improvements, including widening at that intersection that's been accomplished, widening of Claiborne Road, whatever it happens to be.
Well, that'll be up to the city. I mean,
Sure.
But based on what I've read in the traffic study that Gillian prepared, Harvest Point was responsible for the signal when it reached 70% build out. Now, there are factors that have changed as far as the timing of that, but as far as the responsibility of being responsible for providing that traffic signal, at this point, Harvest Point would be responsible for 45% of it instead of 100% of it.
Sure,
So,
completely understood. Yeah, ours was a protected plus permitting signage phase for westbound motorists and a right turn overlap signal phase for northbound. So the signal has changed, the widening may or may not come in. I just want to make sure that we understand that this is very different than the signal that we were required to potentially do at 70%.
How's it different?
So it's more now, isn't it? Aren't you having bigger volumes? Now, this is where I don't speak traffic study very well.
Well, the signal is still a signal. I mean, it was required in 2016 as part of your study, and that's what we're talking about now.
So it's
As
the
far-
exact same signal as a
Mhm.
protected plus permitted signage phase for
Yeah.
westbound and a right turn overlap
The
signal.
only difference, and sorry to interrupt, the only
Yeah.
difference that would happen from a signal standpoint is if it's just the signal itself, it's the protect permissive with the overlap.
Okay,
If it's the widening from a signal standpoint, take out the widening.
okay,
From a signal standpoint, the only difference is one more signal head, and that's it.
okay. That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not a whole lot.
So it's not a totally, because I know at one point I'd heard, potentially crosswalks that may have the handicap ADA, like additional, maybe the sounds and stuff. I think that I'd understood that maybe there would be enhancements made to the original scale of that signal, and I'm just trying to understand what the change would be.
So that maybe predate our involvement in that, but from our perspective, the signal that was alluded to and referred to in your all's traffic study.
It's pretty much the same,
It's the exact same
plus
thing.
one thing
In fact, Gillian's study talks about the protected permissive left turn phase. That's what we're showing here.
Perfect. That, I just didn't fully understand the difference.
Yeah,
So
there's not, I mean, in all intents and purposes, beyond what Trey was saying, that there isn't any difference.
perfect. So my last question, do you know when you would be proposing this
Yeah.
signal to go in?
That's the $1 million question, right? And he's probably looking at me right now saying, Greg, when is it gonna be needed? That's the next, we need to finalize that. We've got some internal thoughts, but, and frankly, it's a bit of a guesswork because there's so, when Gillian did so there's a traffic signal warrant analysis part of the Harvest Point TIS, but it was based on a 45-mile-an-hour speed without all the other developments probably included in that calculation
Sure.
and so forth. So just suffice it to say, there's been changes in the last 5 to 6 years that we'll need to update the traffic signal warrant. And why that's important to the timing is that goes to TDOT. The city will have to get a permit from the department. And as a part of that, that basically gives the departments, being a state route, and if this wasn't a state route, it wouldn't, this wouldn't be needed. But the city will need to approach the department and say, this is what we're planning on doing with the request and their backup information to support that request, right? Well, the Fishback traffic study, this joint study, and then an updated signal warrant analysis will be needed as a part of that support. Again, I'm going to go back to your original question about the timing. We're going to come up with what we think it is. The city probably thinks it needs to be out there pretty soon, if not now. It just kind of depends on how those numbers flesh out, and frankly, that's just some steps that we need to go through to figure that. That was because it gets complicated because you've got this ambient, again, this background growth, but each of these projects are happening at different years, 2022, 24, 27. I mean, he kind of rattled them off when we were in the car coming over here.
2022, 23, 24, 26, and 28.
Now, the realist in me steps back and says, okay, that's all fine and good, but if we can all agree that it's needed, the department may be, I don't want to speak for the TDOT and going through their regional traffic office, but there may be a scenario where we can certainly see by 2028, which again is the full build out, it'll be needed. If we can get close on what we think, maybe we'll have a conversation with the department if they're okay moving ahead. So that's just, we don't know right now because we kind of need to get those final numbers worked out. But also at the end of the day, the department needs to make that decision in consultation and cooperation with the city and I guess us to a certain extent. So we'll figure that out. It could be as early, as within the next, even by the time you got something bid, you're probably still looking at 18, 24 months. But it could be as it'll be 2027. We just don't know, Kelly, right now. We just need to get through that conversation with TDOT to see how they feel about it.
Right.
And I go back to that right turn movement. That's why I spent so much time talking about how complicated the situation is because of how much more right turn movement there is versus left, because we do end up subtracting some of those right turns, and who's to say how heavy that is in any one given year. That's what makes traffic engineering a little maddening sometimes, because we're dealing with things that are fluid and so forth. But luckily, the city understands, the TDOT understands, and they do this all the time. So we just need to have that conversation to see where it all plays out. Yeah. So
On timeline, and this might be a Calvin question, at what point is, I know we're kind of talking about the percentages now, but at what point is our ownership getting invoiced for the
actual dollars. Yeah.
Is that at bid? Is that when construction is finished?
We haven't really talked about that part of it yet, so I don't know if you're at the point where to speak to that, but not to take words out of your mouth, but
Well,
should take a stab maybe.
yeah. What I would share is, one thing that we're looking at is, so I know with SHIP, they prepaid some of their fees, which more than likely, based on their percentage, will roll over to the other SHIP as well. But definitely, we would know before the certificate of occupancy. So we have some time to work. Again, we're open for the conversation if you need to get something done faster.
It's really a yin yang or cart before the horse kind of thing, because until it's bid, I mean, y'all know, you don't really know what that cost is, and so if we want to get maybe through the design. I know, just thinking, we were just kind of talking out loud about it. Maybe let's get preliminary design where we have quantity. We actually have quantities and stuff we can peg pay item, price items to, and see where that falls out. And at that point, the decision. Well, the city might be in a better position to say, do we want to go with this, or do we wait? Do we get closer to bid? And so that will go back to the timing. Now, where does the timing of all this play out? And all of y'all have different timelines on your project, so there's no one answer on that. So it's a little complicated from that standpoint. But I feel like we can get pretty close. Again, I don't want to speak for the city because some of this will have to be worked out in the future, in particular with y'all's particular agreements. But there may be some carryover or refund or whatever, depending on if in fact the city decides to get some of that on the front end before it's bid. But that's the decision making that you kind of have to go through with this to figure out what. There's no perfect answer, quite honestly. I mean, because there's kind of there's not difficulties, but there's plus and minuses to kind of doing it both ways. So just what everybody's agreeable to and what the city feels like is best for them.
Yeah, I think knowing that there's an option, which it sounds like there is, to prepay is what I'm looking for. Just as like we're probably going to be looking, depending on how a few things shake out, to apply for a certificate of occupancy within 18 months. So I just want to make sure there's some way for us to pay and do our share.
I think the city's intended to move, at least, again, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I think what we've discussed is maybe moving ahead with a design so we can get a little bit better, again, with your all's jobs and careers, y'all do this all the time. If we can get a design, and we'll get within 10% or so and feel, I mean, especially when you start breaking it down between nine developments, so they all have different percentages, but we'll be within a manageable amount to try to make something we can sleep with and be okay with. So if that's the intent, that's how it plays out. We'll know, the next, I don't want to put a timeline to it, but here in the future, for near future, kind of what we think that is. I mean, typically signals can range anywhere from $250,000 to $350,000. If that gives y'all just some sense, we were kind of prepared to put that out there, just because it's just typically what they go for. But we just won't know specifically till we get a little bit closer, and then how the process plays out.
Yeah, great. That's understood. I just want to make sure we
Yeah.
have our opportunity
Yeah.
to see regardless.
Yeah. Just some of it's just fluid, but that's okay. All right, so this is kind of a wrap up, everybody. So again, we continue to take questions, but the finalized improvements, like I said, I think we're kind of there. We'll put together kind of an opinion of cost that's documented in our kind of final report. Again, we'll know more and better as the design moves forward, and then we'll completely document the equitable share component of that. And then going back to what Kelly was asking about as far as kind of when we think it'll, I'm being kind of gentle in how we phrase it, because it's kind of an opinion of the opinion of cost and opinion of implementation here. We'll put some numbers and some information out there to kind of get a sense, but there's other dynamics involved, like we were talking about with TDOT and the approval process and that kind of thing, to know exactly when that might happen. But safe is to say, as we transition out of the study phase and get into more kind of engineering and pre-development, pre-implementation, there'll be a design and survey and design done, and then we'll go, of course, if Calvin allows, and once our assistance, we'll go through a TDOT permit. It's not a big deal. It happens. I mean, there's signals everywhere. They go through all the time. But just a documentation process that we'll have to go through, and primarily just getting the department's okay, just from the timing of the signal and the schedules. Well, I probably would say not timing's a bad word, but to schedule the signal and when that looks to move forward. So specifically what we plan on doing is we've already started, Trey started working on the actual report and documentation side of it. Once we get through the city review of that, our intent is we'll circulate all that by email to you all, so you'll have a copy of that, and certainly open to more questions or for anything else that's needed as far as that goes. But with the city's okay and blessing, we'll certainly make that report available. The good news is it won't be anything different than what we've already been talking about and what we've discussed both last time and this time. We had some availability to come back with a third meeting if there was any need for it. We have not discussed this with Calvin or staff, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But I don't see a lot more changing other than just really putting dollars to this. Once we really know what the dollars are, we're more than happy to come back with another kind of discussion if anybody has a wrap up or anything. But just you all can leave here knowing that what we've discussed today and what we've shown is kind of what we're moving forward with. So, any concerns or questions or anything that we can help elaborate on, we're more than happy to entertain that now. But
I have one more question, and this is kind of specific to Beechcroft and potentially also SHIP. We had another condition in addition to the shared cost of the dedicating the additional right-of-way. Is that something we'll just do through a final plat once the design is complete?
Mhm.
Okay. Just want to make sure we know a timeline on that so we don't let it slip through.
yeah. Anything else? All right. Well, we appreciate y'all's participation. Those good questions. I mean, that's exactly what we're hoping for. And if y'all have any specific questions, again, at some point it does get kind of one-on-one discussions between y'all's particular situations and the development's particular situations and the city as they work out the formality of the agreements. And I'm sure those will be had and discussed more on a one-on-one. But again, it's just trying to be transparent and kind of put everything out there so y'all know what to expect. That's the main thing. Just we don't want folks to walk away not having any or different expectations. We don't want no one wants surprises or anything along those lines. So that's what we're trying to accomplish. So Calvin, if there's anything else that you'd like to say or maybe elaborate on, feel free.
Yeah, at this point, of course, Kelly and I will have another conversation. Of course, Pam will be involved in that conversation as well to figure out some of your concerns. But the idea is to move forward sooner than later. So after this meeting, and again, I don't want to put words in Greg's mouth. I know we're going to have to work with some assumptions in terms of costs, because our next step is we want to work with Greg and his team to begin design.
Yeah.
We want to submit our information to Stanley and TDOT as soon as possible, because I think with the development going on at that intersection, the sooner the better. I hope things move quickly, but just giving you a heads up, we're looking to come back with some numbers sooner than later.
I mean, I think just talking, because we do want to walk away with some some kind of expectation or knowledge of kind of what the next steps are. Getting survey design, that's not a huge process, especially if we're just talking about a traffic signal. So, I mean, that's probably a 6-month or less process by the time we get everything worked out. So, as we get into early next year, toward the end of this year, we should have, some better idea of what the actual timeline will be. And then, of course, that's simultaneous to that engineering process. There'll be discussions with TDOT to get a better idea of kind of what that looks like and where they come down on getting with Stanley and everybody over at the region. So, just thinking out loud, that's something that Trey and I will work on as far as the documentation work and helping the city with that permitting process, so that we don't want to get to the very end and then say, oh, TDOT, hey, by the way, here's this request for signal. We want to get that conversation and communication, coordination with the department on the front end of that. So yeah, I mean, it's not like designing a road or anything, as y'all know. So it's not. But again, there's still a process to get things bid and out the door and that kind of stuff. So honestly, that's why we're a lot of folks that drive through that intersection, I'm sure would love to have it now. But we are, again, if you look at the numbers, it's probably not warranted right now, just with the volumes that are out there with the things that we were talking about. So the fact that we're in the pipeline, we're getting things going. I mean, I feel pretty comfortable with where it is as far as before a lot of your all's projects come online. So I think there's been a lot of other situations that have been more behind the 8 ball, if you will, than maybe this situation is to a certain extent. So I think seems pretty reasonable to me. So. All right, well, y'all enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you all for being here, and certainly if y'all have any questions, feel free to reach out to the city and us, and